Hi, I'm Elke. When people ask me what I do for a living, I say I write children's books. And they go, oh, lovely. Anything we know? And I go, well, I write children's books to explain death to the under fives. That's usually a pretty good conversation stopper. Now, this wasn't a conscious decision. Let me take you back to 2009. I was happily married with 2 children, Alex and Olivia. Alex was 3 and Olivia 11 months. And my husband Martin and Alex decided to go on a father-son bonding weekend. They drove 200 miles to a caravan in the Lake District, and Alex was so excited. He kept saying, oh, it's just me and Daddy, no girls allowed. And they had a really good time. Now, Martin was a shift working police officer, so having a few days with his daddy was really, really special. And, you know, this was going to become a thing for Martin and Alex, and for me and Olivia, just to spend time together with one child. But as it happened, that was the first time and the last time we ever got to do such a thing. Because on April 22nd, 2009, the day they were due to come back from their little holiday, my phone rang. And because I was feeding Olivia and I was having my lunch, I ignored it and I let it go through to answer phone. Who could it be after all? I spoke to Martin in the morning, they were packing up, they were having breakfast, they were coming back, and he'd said, I'll see you later. So when I listened to the message, my world changed. Because what the message said was, please phone the caravan park immediately. Your husband has been taken seriously ill. And he's been taken away by ambulance and we don't know any more. What? I couldn't take in what I just heard, and I googled caravan park and I phoned them, and the voice told me the same thing again. Your husband has been taken seriously ill and he's been taken away by ambulance. And I'm going, that can't be. I'm going, where's my son? My son's 3, where is he? Still expecting there to be some mistake. And the voice said, your son's here, we're looking after him. He's been very good. And I went, well, put him on, I need to speak to him. And then I heard his little voice tell me excitedly how him and Daddy had been swimming and the pool was shut and they might go back again if there was time before coming home. And I realised that was my little boy talking, which must mean that my husband had been taken away by ambulance. And that was that. My room started spinning and I saw black and white and I started sweating, and I said goodbye to Alex and I phoned my in-laws and we decided to drive down together. After all, we didn't know what had happened. So meanwhile, I googled hospitals, I phoned several hospitals, nobody knew where he was, nobody had seen him come in, and that was that. So my in-laws and I met in a car park, and it was there that I got another phone call. And the voice on the other line said, where are you? We need to send a police officer to come and see you. And I went, no. I'm going, please, will you just tell me if my husband died? Because my 3-year-old son is all on his own and I need to go and see him. And the voice hesitated and repeated that she would have to send a police officer to come and see us. And I just went, I'm a police officer's wife. I know how this works. I need to go and see my 3-year-old son. I'm a 4-hour drive away. Please, will you just tell me if he died? And that's how I found out that my 34-year-old husband had had a heart attack and he had died. And I was a young widow with 2 kids under 4 and everything went black. My mother-in-law kind of thought that, you know, we should probably pile into one car so I could drive Martin's car back the next day, which hadn't even occurred to me. So that's what we did. I packed some stuff. I threw Alex's toy ambulance into a suitcase because I knew he would have to tell me what had happened through play. And sort of bizarrely, just by pure coincidence, I'd read an article about childhood bereavement a few weeks earlier. I think it was the time when Jade Goody had passed away. And it said, you know, you need to be really honest and use age-appropriate language. So it took about 4 hours to get there. And nobody said a word. I remember just staring out of the window, trying to figure out what to say to my son. How to explain to a 3-year-old that his daddy was never coming back. By the time we arrived, I knew what I wanted to say. And we got there, and I saw him straight away, and he looked really happy. He was playing away. He'd been well looked after. I got out the car. I handed my daughter to whoever was nearest, and I walked over to him. And he spotted me and he went, "Oi, no girls allowed. What are you doing here, Mum?" Right. But I knew I had to say what I planned to say in my head in the car for 4 hours over and over again, here and now, or it would never come out. So I knelt in front of him and I put his head against my chest and I said, "Can you hear that?" And Alex said, "I can hear a funny bump, bump, bump." I said, "That's right. That's a heart, sweetheart. Everybody's got one. But when it stops beating, your body doesn't work anymore. And you can't walk or talk anymore or tickle little boys or wear them on your head. And unfortunately, Daddy's heart has stopped beating and he can never come back." "But where is he?" Alex said. And I explained that some people like to think of dead people as up in the sky and how they could be a cloud or a star. And he just shouted, "I don't want Daddy to be a star. I want him to come back down." But I knew he couldn't come back down. I didn't even know if there was such a thing as dead people turning into stars. Everybody believes a different thing, and I explained that to him too. And I explained again how Daddy's body had stopped working because his heart had stopped beating and how he died. And Alex said, "But did he say please?" And I went, "Yeah, he said please." "Did he say please, 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 I need to go and see my little boy?" I said, "Yes, he did, Alex. But sometimes people are so badly hurt or broken that they can't be fixed. Not even by ambulance people." "The ambulance people couldn't fix my daddy?" he asked. "No, sweetheart. Sometimes nobody can help. And sadly, your daddy couldn't be fixed, and he died. But I'm very, very proud of you because Alex was actually the one who managed to alert somebody who called an ambulance, and Martin died at the scene inside the ambulance. So I said, I'm very, very proud of you, Alex. You've done exactly the right thing." But he worried and he said, "But what if I hadn't gotten help? Would Daddy still be okay?" And I gave him a big hug and I said, "No, Alex. Daddy would have just died where he was without the ambulance people helping him." For now, The questions stopped. But child grief is different to grieving adults. It's often described as jumping in and out of puddles, because what grieving children do is they go through developmental stages, different comprehensions. When they're so small, they don't know anything. So they could be happily playing 1 second, and then they can be really upset the next, and all the way through they will just ask you questions again and again and again. But to a child, there's no difference between asking, how does an aeroplane stay in the air, for example? Or, do spaghetti grow on trees, mummy? Or, what happened to daddy's body? What does death mean? For you see, when I ask you this question, what picture pops into your head when you think about the word death? Chances are it's a pretty uncomfortable one, because you're familiar with the word death. You're familiar with what it means. You understand eternity, you understand forever, you understand grief, you understand sadness. But do you know what a 3-year-old thinks when he hears the word death or died? He doesn't think anything, because he doesn't know what the word means. He doesn't even know yet that such a thing exists. So the questions continued. The next one was, will you have to die, mummy? And I nodded and I said, yes, Alex, everybody has to die, but most people don't die until they're very old. And he looked at me and he went, even older than Granny and Grandpa? I couldn't help but smile, and I said, yes, even older than Granny and Grandpa. So I explained how you grow up, you go from being a child to being an adult, you look after your children if you have them, you grow old, and then you die. Most people. And straight away he asked, can children die? And again I said yes, but it doesn't happen very often, so please try not to worry. And then he went, who will look after me when you die, mummy? And I said, well, Auntie Silke will. But what if she dies? Well, then Oma and Opa will. But what if they die? Then Granny and Grandpa will. But what if they die? And he was so worried that I didn't just rubbish it and say, oh no, that would never happen. But instead I decided we would sit down and write a list of all the people we love very much who might be able to look after Alex and Olivia if I died. And that reassured him for a bit. Then one night in bed, he looked at me and he went, how many more sleeps until Christmas, mummy? And I'm going, I don't know, 167? He's still 3, by the way. And he goes, right, okay. And how many more sleeps until I have to die? I didn't know what to say. See, there's all these people who kept telling me that children are too young to understand and that they would just forget. The thing is, they're not. And I have to be honest, I wouldn't have chosen to sit my kids down at that young age and explain that, you know, everybody has to die. But I didn't have the luxury not to do that. The first death we'd encountered was the death of the daddy. And it was up to me to help them understand. So I thought, let's get a book that'll help me explain what had happened, that will explain death. But I couldn't find anything. Eventually somebody recommended Badger's Parting Gift. But as soon as I read it, I knew it wasn't helpful for us. Because Martin wasn't old. Martin didn't know he was going to die that day. Or any time soon for that matter. But crucially, Martin wasn't a badger. Because you see, children of that age are too young to understand metaphors, and they think very, very literally. Let me give you an example of that. So there was this little girl, it's a true story, this little girl whose mother died, and her family wanted to go and visit her grave because she was buried, and they explained to this little girl, you know, how they would go to the graveyard, and her mother was under the ground, and there was a headstone at the end of the grave, you know, to show her name so people could, you know, find where she'd been put to rest. And the girl started screaming and didn't want to go. And they couldn't understand why, but no amount of trying to persuade her made her budge. She did not want to go. So they left her with friends and visited the grave themselves. And only months or possibly years later, it turned out that when they'd said the word headstone, this girl had pictured her actual dead mother's head turned to stone that was sitting at the end of the grave looking at her. I mean, oh my God, like, no wonder she was frightened. So there's so many things we need to think about when we think about explaining death to children. The most important one is they think very literally, but also it's really, really important to tell the truth. And I found that by telling my son the truth, you know, it didn't freak him out. It didn't scare him. You know, it just helped him make sense. And it retained the trust between me and him. And it gave him the freedom and the confidence and the space to ask me questions. And I promised both of my children that they can ask me any question and they will always get a straight answer. And they have. And it's not always easy, I'm not going to lie. But they have. My kids are now nearly 15 and 12. And like I say, they were 3 and 11 months at the time. So yeah, there's a lot of developmental stages to go through. And like I mentioned earlier, it's a bit like jumping in and out of puddles. And when they're so little, they have no concept of forever. And no amount of telling your toddler that daddy can never come back will make them understand that they genuinely never can come back. Because this magical thinking is, you know, when you blow out your birthday candles and you make a wish, well, it takes about until they're 8 or 9 for them to understand that they can't bring them back. And even though I'd been really honest with Alex from the start, that's exactly what happened. When he was about 8 or 9, he just was in tears. Because he'd finally understood that every year he wished for the same thing on his birthday when he blew out his candles, and his daddy just wasn't going to come back. He couldn't make him come back. And I remember him shouting, "It's not fair!" You know, and I just put my arms around him and I said, "You know what? It's not fair, you're right." And I think it's really important, you know, to acknowledge that grief and say, yes, it hurts. I'm really sorry it happened, but I can't fix it. And I told him again how proud I was of him that, you know, he managed to get help. And he said, "Oh, Mum, if only I'd been a bit bigger, then I could have run a bit faster and I could have got the ambulance there sooner and maybe he would still be alive today." And I gave him a big hug and I said, "No, Alex, I'm really sorry." I was like, you've done so well and I'm so, so proud of you. I couldn't have done anything differently. You know, I spoke to the paramedics, I spoke to the doctors, I spoke to the pathologists, and they all agreed that your daddy was just going to die that day. And I thought it would make him feel better. But instead, he started beating himself up even more. And do you know what he said? I'll never forget it. He said, "Mummy, if I've known he was going to die anyway, I wouldn't have bothered running to get an ambulance. I would have just sat with him and hugged him and told him I loved him." So when people tell you that children don't remember and they get over it, they're wrong. Because children grieve just like us adults do, but differently, I guess, because they grieve in stages, and you know, every time their developmental capacity lets them understand a bit more, the grieving starts all over again, and they're grieving for things that you comprehended the second you heard that somebody had died. And the best we can do, in fact the only thing we can do, is to be by their side, acknowledge the hurt, and help them understand. It is my job as a parent to help them understand even the really, really difficult and the really, really horrible things in life. Sometimes people say, but I don't want to upset them. Or I didn't know what to say, they were still so young, so I just told them Daddy was still at work. Or I told him he's gone to a better place. And while that may seem kinder and easier to you at the time, what happens when they get a bit older? And what happens when they start wondering why Daddy'd gone to a better place and what they'd done to make him want to go away and why they couldn't come with him? And when they realise that Daddy's been at work for an awfully long time now and ask you when he's coming back, what do you say then? It's really, really tricky. And I'm not going to lie, I didn't always know what to say. But crucially, I never lied. And I remember being really frightened about explaining cremation to my son, because I thought, you know, he's just going to think that he hurts. And I did take them to the funeral. But at the time, I just explained that it was a place where we would all talk about Daddy and tell funny stories. And they kind of went with that because I didn't know what to say. And at the time, he hadn't really asked. But of course, the time comes when they do ask. And one day he just went, Mom, did the doctors chop Daddy's arms and legs off? What? Did they chop his arms and legs off? Because you said he can't walk anymore and he can't use his body anymore. So did they chop them off? And I thought, oh my God, all this time when I thought I'd explained really well, he must have thought a body is a torso. So I was so grateful he had the courage to ask. And I sat him down and explained, you know, how a dead body usually still looks like a whole person. And, you know, I said, do you remember being at the crematorium? And he nodded. And I said, do you remember the big wooden box? And he went, yeah. And I said, well, Daddy's dead body was inside it. And after we told our funny stories, it went down into the cellar of the crematorium, and the coffin with the dead body inside it were put into something like a really hot oven, and they got burned. And Alex went, oh, and the dead body doesn't feel anything anymore because it's dead, so it didn't hurt, right? And I went, yes, that's exactly right. And you know, he wasn't distraught and he wasn't screaming and he wasn't crying. He was just really, really happy to have been able to connect another piece of the puzzle of what happened to his daddy, why he just gone from one second to the other. And for me, it felt like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders, because I'd finally explained that last thing that I was too scared to explain before. And in our house, death is just a normal part of life. You know, Martin is still part of our family, even though about 13 months after Martin died, I met my new partner, John, who's now my second husband. And my kids call him Dad. And he came with 5 kids. So all of a sudden we were this huge family. But, you know, Martin will always be part of it. And then I'd explained to Alex about ashes, and he'd asked me if I had Daddy's ashes, and I explained that I did, and at the time we looked at it together, and he asked to touch them, which freaked me out, to be fair. But because he looked so curious, and he had so much anticipation, and he looked up to me, that I decided, okay, let's do it. So we opened the box and we drew little hearts into the ashes like you would in sand on the beach. And it was really, really nice. It was really therapeutic. It was a really positive experience, and I'm really glad we had the courage to do that. So initially I'd wanted to spread Martin's ashes when the kids were much, much older, but you know, life has a habit of moving on, and you know, well, by the way, we don't move on, we just keep on moving because we haven't got a choice. We can't stop time, we can't go back. So, you know, we don't replace one person with another, just like you wouldn't, you know, you wouldn't be frightened to have a second child, and you know, you just love both of them. So anyway, the time came that I'd said I wanted to spread Martin's ashes, and Alice was really, really upset. And I explained to him that, you know, it didn't mean, spreading his ashes didn't mean we would forget about him, and you know, that nobody could ever replace him. And I said, how would you feel about keeping a little bit of your daddy's ashes as a very special memory? And I showed him 2 little glass bottles with a tiny little cork in them. And instantly he perked up and he said, I would like that. So we got the ashes and we filled up our little bottles with a little bit of their daddy's ashes as a special memory. And with some of the ashes we planted a tree, which we took with us when we moved house. And the rest of the ashes we spread in a special place. And again, the kids were really involved, and they knew what they were doing. They knew they were spreading the dead daddy's ashes. And it was a really positive experience, which I hadn't thought was possible. And again, I'm so grateful I had the courage to do it. And these tiny little glass bottles with their daddy's ashes, they treasure them, and they move around their rooms, and every once in a while I find one that gets a cuddle of a little Kinder Egg toy, which is lovely and heartbreaking in equal measures. But unfortunately, the death of their dad wasn't the only difficult thing I had to explain. Because less than 3 years later, in March 2012, I was diagnosed with a very aggressive breast cancer. I was so scared that I was going to die and my kids would have nobody. You know, that whole question, who will look after me when you die, Mummy? That you think, that's never going to happen? Well, it was right here. And it was horrible. And like I mentioned before, John came with 5 kids. By now we were living together. And all of a sudden, I had to explain to 7 children, aged between 3 and 15, that I had cancer and that I might die. And again, I was so grateful because the kids weren't frightened to ask questions. And they said, are you going to die, Mummy? And I said, I might. But the doctors have told me that the treatment's going to work. And we explained to them chemotherapy and surgery and radiotherapy. And when that happened, when I went through chemo, the kids weren't freaking out because we told them what would happen. We were honest about it. As you can see, I'm still here. And for that, I am very grateful every day. I remember finishing treatment and thinking, oh, finally some good news. And the first question that came out of Alex's mouth was, can you get cancer twice? And I went, yes, Alex, you can get cancer twice. But I also know a lot of people who've beaten cancer twice. And that is also true. So I'm now happily remarried. But the grieving doesn't stop. And I would just like to finish with one little story. I think we were already married and had been through cancer. When John, my second husband, said, I feel like Alex is struggling to accept me. And I went, really? And he goes, yeah, I do. I'm going, I don't think so. He calls you dad. He goes, I just have a feeling. So I went, okay. So I went up to Alex and I sat down and I drew a heart on a piece of paper. And I gave him a box of crayons and I said, Alex, pick up any colour and colour in how much of your heart is filled with sadness that Daddy died. So no surprises, he picked up black and filled that much in. And I said, that's a big space. And he said, yes, Mum, it's a big sad. I'm going, fair enough, it is. So then I asked him to write down all the names of all the people who he loves and is friends with. And then I asked him to pick a different colour for each of these people and to give them all a space in his heart. And he looked at it and he went, but there's not really much space left. And he started crying. And he said, but I can't take any of the black away because it would be like I stopped being sad that Daddy died. And I don't want to lose my memories. So I said, well, what can we do? I don't know, Mum. So I sat down and I drew a bigger heart around the little heart. And all of a sudden, we had enough space to give everyone space in our heart. Because I believe that the hole in your heart doesn't get smaller, but the trick is to make the world around it bigger. So I guess what I'm trying to say, from experience, I can tell you that I believe that the only way we can protect our children, because we all want to protect our children, but the only way we can truly protect them is with the best version of the truth. Thank you for listening. I know there's been a couple of questions. I only want to address two of them quickly. One was, how do you explain death and bereavement to children on the autistic spectrum? Now, I know by the nature of the word spectrum, there is a vast spectrum from very high functioning to non-verbal. Now, as it happens, Alex is on the autistic spectrum, but he is very high functioning. And I would say, you know, just the same thing. Use age-appropriate language, wherever the child is on the spectrum. It might have to be simpler words, or, you know, they might have to be more complicated, because Alex is actually very, very complex in his thinking and academically does extremely well. But he thinks still very, very literally. So just bear that in mind. Beware that whatever you say to an autistic child, they will take at face value. So if I tell Alex to keep his nose clean at school, he will literally go to the mirror and check his nose, because he doesn't understand the hidden meaning behind it. So that's kind of like my take. Another question was, how can you support someone who doesn't want to talk about their grief? Well, I guess, you know, I think, first of all, everybody grieves differently, and just because what works for you might not work for another person. I understand the need to want to fix. I understand the need to want to help. I think all you can do is provide opportunities to talk, have open conversations, maybe say something like, you know, when my friend died or my mum died, it made me feel like this. or, you know, this really helped me. Is there anything I can do for you? But at the end of the day, you can't fix people. You can only be by their side and be there for them. The only person you can fix and the only person you can make happy is yourself. It's not your responsibility to fix anybody else, but it'd be really good and really nice if you could be present for these people, be they children or adults, and give them the opportunity to speak if they want to. So I guess that's me. I guess I just told you a story, and hopefully through that you now understand how children think a little bit better, and that in turn will help you speak to them and explain these difficult subjects. So always think the truth, but the best version of the truth. Thank you.